This is a quote from the Libel of English Policy. I expect you all know this title well. It's a pamphlet, in effect, written around 1435, probably by Adam Molins, who was a bishop and a member of the Royal Council, and in rhyming verse. Most of it is about English trade, but it does, in fact, include an idea of what Henry V's policy was. And the writer has no doubts about his purposing when at Hampton he made the great dromons. It was not else but that he cast to be Lord roundabout in Varon of the sea. Now this is a large claim, which chimed well for the editor of the printed text, Sir George Warner, with later ideas of the emergence of England as a great maritime power. He claimed that the author's wisdom and foresight when suggesting this motivation for Henry V had been amply confirmed in the succeeding centuries. Other commentators commend Henry's strategic sense. Nicholas Rogers sees him as deliberately building up a fleet to strike at the heart of the French king's position by invading Normandy, but holds that the sea in general remained a debatable space outside any man's control. Henry's naval policy has been summarised in Helen Nicholson's Medieval Warfare as merely the maintenance of a small squadron of ships for personal use, a kind of equivalent of the modern executive jet, and is not mentioned at all in some histories of the 100 Years' War. Here in Southampton, Henry is perhaps best remembered as the builder of the largest of all medieval warships, his great ship, the Grace Dieu, the wreck of which still lies in the bed of the Hamble River, and about which John Adams will be speaking later tomorrow. When beginning a reassessment of Henry's naval policy, it is useful as a starting point to consider what views of or knowledge of war at sea he might have had at the beginning of his reign. Certainly it is very likely that he looked back to the crushing victory of his forebear Edward III at the Battle of Sluis in 1340. He may well have had a high opinion of the image on Edward's gold noble of the victorious king on board his ship, the Cog Thomas, as the writer of the Libel, who wrote, "For four things our noble showeth to me, king, ship and sword, and power of the sea." And there you see Edward III holding his sword on board his ship. Very nicely put. The somewhat later, 1350, successful naval encounter with the Castilian allies of France, known as les Espagnols sur mer, would have reinforced that image. He might have been less eager to recall the burning of English ships and the loss of treasure at the Battle of La Rochelle in 1370. Apart from these, all well in the past, there were no great naval battles to call to mind. Richard II's reign had largely been a time of truces, while his father had merely encouraged, or at least not restrained, low-level commerce raiding at sea. There was, therefore, no immediate reason for him to pay much attention to the possible maritime aspects of war with France. The many expeditions of the English against the French in the first phase of the 100 Years' War had all, at some time, necessitated the organisation of a fleet to bring men and supplies across the Channel. But there are few records of these being intercepted or the landings being opposed. Most previous experience showed that fighting began once the expeditionary forces had landed and moved inland, to face the enemy. Moreover, even though Henry IV had paid rather more attention to royal ships than Richard II, he seems to have seen them more as a means of symbolising his power and wealth than as instruments of war. The accounts of the Clerk of the King's ships in this reign have more details concerning the decoration or ornamentation of royal ships than their armaments. His Grace-Dieu, not to be confused with the later great ship of Henry V, had a great golden eagle on the bowsprit and a golden crown on the beak. The whole vessel was gaudily painted in several colours, with red predominating. His Trinity, which he had inherited from Richard II, had 4 gilded images of saints on the stern and 2 eagles on the cellier, and also displayed multiple escutcheons showing the royal arms and the image of the garter. This is a typical manuscript illustration of a royal fleet of this date. You can see the row of shields along the gunwale and the multiple flags also displayed. The royal barge for use on the Thames was painted in red and gold, with at least 2 figures of royal leopards wearing golden collars. Over the first 7 years of Henry IV's reign, nearly £4,000 was spent on the royal ships, but around a quarter of this was spent on a single voyage. The vessels which brought Joan of Navarre, his second wife, from Brittany to England in 1402. In the final years of his reign, expenditure on the royal ships almost entirely ceased. Less than £300 in this whole period. The 2 vessels so brightly decorated at the beginning of the reign were laid up at Radcliffe on the Thames, and the Grace-Dieu was in fact granted to the Earl of Somerset in 1409. There were no immediate signs of any change in this neglect of the royal ships in the first months of Henry V's reign. The account for the first 5 months of the new reign state that the Clerk of the King's ships had received no money and had likewise spent none. The appointment of William Catton as clerk in July 1413 might seem to herald a new approach. Expenditure and also the number of royal ships increased. The policy followed, however, is very much the same as that of Henry V's great-grandfather, Edward III. A new Trinity was built as the royal ship and as gaily painted as her predecessor. Royal ships were used on trading voyages, largely for wine to Bordeaux, raising the considerable sum of £2,000 in freight charges in the years 1413 to 16. This was a practice commonly used by Edward III. The lack of any new thinking concerning the royal ships is made clear when looking at the steps taken by the Privy Council in 1415 to prepare the realm for the imminent war with France. The minutes of the meeting in February 1415, attended by the very experienced commander Sir Thomas Erpingham, and also Thomas Beaufort, Earl of Dorset, the Lieutenant of Guienne, set out the requirements of the Guard of the Sea. This would consist of 2 great ships, 5 barges, and 5 ballingers to protect the coast all the way from Plymouth to Berwick, manned by 252 men-at-arms, 252 archers, and 536 sailors, an overall total of 1,040 men. This was not an entirely negligible force, but not one that could counter a sustained attack. A further minute of the expenditure on the Guard for the period from June 1415, it was just before the king left for France, to June 1416, before the attempt was made to lift the siege of Harfleur, implies that it was at least partially set up as the council desired. £1,231 15 shillings had been spent on the masters, crews and fighting men of 4 ships, not the original 8 required. Probably in the first months of 1416, however, there seems to have been a dramatic change in the attitude to the possibility of war at sea, leading to the abandonment of the low-key policy exemplified in the setting up of the Guard of the Sea. Expenditure soared. The creation of Henry's squadron of great ships began in earnest. The centre of activity moved definitively to Southampton, and new administrators were appointed. What had brought all this about? What in mind had Henry V? One factor may well have been the news that the French were seeking ships in Genoa to pursue the war with England. Morosini, the very well-informed Venetian chronicler, records that an embassy from France was in Genoa in January 1416. His information was that the French had asked for 20 galleys to be at the expense of the French to help retake Harfleur. The Genoese chronicler Giustiniani was more precise, stating that the French entered into a 10-year agreement for the Republic to supply 8 large ships, 600 crossbowmen, and 8 galleys. This development undoubtedly alarmed Henry and his advisers. The king certainly knew what was going on, since the author of the Gesta Henrici Quinti sees this agreement as evidence of French duplicity, since they concluded this alliance while engaged in diplomatic negotiations for a truce with the English. The fact that the Genoese operated very successfully a fleet of very large, high-sided sailing ships was common knowledge in maritime circles, not least in Southampton, which Genoese carracks had visited regularly from the late 14th century. This is a rather later picture of carracks, but it gives you some idea of quite how large they were. They were, in fact, equipped normally with at least 2, if not 3 masts, and were effective at sea. You can see on the far right of this picture a galley. So if you compare the freeboard of the carrack with the galley, you can see the difference and how effective that could be in a boarding action. Well before leaving for France on the 11th of August 1415 from this port, Henry had already begun to make use of Southampton and neighbouring waters as the muster area for fleets crossing the Channel. William Soper, who had close trading links with the Genoese, was already employed by the Crown on the rebuilding of the prize the Santa Clara as the Holy Ghost. It is not unreasonable to speculate that Soper would advise the Crown of the danger posed to English shipping, whether engaged in trade or in support of military operations, by a force of carracks in the pay of France in the Channel. The first clear indication that one way of countering this threat would be a major shipbuilding initiative dates from July 1416. On the 20th, Soper and others, including the master carpenter later employed on the Grastier, were ordered to start obtaining all the timber, ironwork and other supplies needed for such a project. The building of the Jesus was already well underway in the Rother Valley, since she was completed in November 1417. Some smaller ships were also constructed to support the major vessels, most notably the Falcon and the Valentine. Most of this work was to take place in a port not previously much used, either for shipbuilding on a large scale or as a base for the royal ships. One motive for this move of most work on the king's ships away from the Thames, where work had centred on either Radcliffe or Deptford, may have been the need for a location near to a reliable source of good shipbuilding timber. Southampton, on the borders of the New Forest, with its plentiful supply of mature oak trees, also had trading links which ensured adequate supplies of iron for nails and other fixing from Bilbao, and also ropes and cables from Brittany, Bridport and the Baltic. There was also the strategic consideration that the Norman coast was easily accessible, with the new war now centred on this region rather than the Dover Straits. Southampton had been thought too vulnerable to French raids after the disastrous attack in 1338, but this was no longer seems to have weighed heavily with the king, who provided forces to guard the anchorage. The impractical implications of the move to Southampton can be seen in the increasing number of jobs heaped on Sofa and others involving musters and the like, as well as the supervision of the building of the Grâce-Dieu. William Catton remained in post as clerk of the king's ships until 1420, but was probably overshadowed by Soper. Soper's pay increased, along with his importance to the king, from 20 marks for life from the customs in April 1416 to his appointment in July 1418 at 12pence a day as surveyor of the king's carracks and ballingers, and finally in February 1420 on his appointment as governor of the king's ships on a wage of £40 a year, with approval to appoint a clerk to assist him, a higher rate than that paid to Catton. The office of the royal ships at Southampton soon had permanent buildings, including a large a forge and a storehouse built of stone. The Longhouse, identified in the Terrier of 1454, may have been the mast store for the royal ships. You can see it down here by the Watergate. There, do you see? Also at the Watergate was, of course, Soper's office, which still exists. There were no permanent buildings at all at sites like Radcliffe or Smallhithe. Southampton was on the way to acquiring something much more like a permanent naval base and dockyard. This is Soper's office. I rather imagine he probably operated perhaps at first floor level with his clerk down in the basement. The anchorage of the great ships in the Hamble was also protected by a purpose-built bulwark manned by a guard of 40 men-at-arms and with a protective chain across the anchorage. The much better survival of well-kept books of particulars, sometimes in conjunction with the book of the Controller, for Soper's period as keeper of the king's ships, are also a clear sign of a well-run and firmly established administration. This is the opening page of the first of Soper's books of particulars, and you will note on the left-hand side a clear list of contents, something sadly lacking from many medieval manuscripts. Events, in fact, did nothing to allay English fears of the resurgent French interest in maritime affairs. Unsuccessful raids made by the French on Portland and elsewhere on the coast had taken place in June 1416. The Battle of Harfleur in August 1416, which resulted in the capture of 3 Genoese carracks by the English, made plain that alarm at the military potential of these vessels was justified, but that determined attacks on the carracks could be successful at a price. The battle off Harfleur lasted for 5 or 6 hours, with at least 1,500 dead. The perception that at least a nucleus of large high-sided ships was now essential for success in any engagement at sea was further heightened by an incident in September off Calais, when 6 Ballingers, these had a much lower freeboard, then not perhaps as little as a galley, but certainly nothing like the amount of freeboard of a carrack. 6 Ballingers fought a prolonged and bloody engagement with 1 Genoese carrack, and were finally forced to withdraw when their missiles were exhausted, leaving the carrack to make good her escape. They were unable to board her because of the difference in freeboard, and of course this is taking place at sea, not in a bay or an estuary, but on the high seas, and the boarding ladders were thrown back by the carrack's crew every time an attempt was made to board her. A policy to deal with the threat posed by the carracks in the Channel seems to have been devised and put into operation from the summer of 1417, at least until the conclusion of the Treaty of Troyes. From 1417 to 1420, regular patrols were sent out to scour the Channel for enemy shipping, with the core of each squadron consisting of the most effective of the King's ships. In both 1417 and 1418, the King and his advisers were clearly nervous of French intentions regarding direct attacks on England, and even worried about the threat of a possible invasion. In June 1417, there were fears for shipping in the Thames, since there were news of a French fleet off the Downs. A general commission in 1418 ordered the Sheriff of Hampshire to organise local defence forces on the coast, including watchers for enemy ships, with some men required particularly to guard the King's ships. The tactic of regular patrolling, however, was undoubtedly highly successful. In 1417, no fewer than 3 squadrons were at sea, with the most successful being under the command of the Earl of Huntingdon. This was responsible for the spectacular capture of no fewer than 4 Genoese carracks, all of which were renamed and absorbed into the King's fleet. Another, the S, was taken by Sir Hugh Courtenay, but wrecked off Southampton shortly afterwards. In all, 5 carracks and 5 other vessels were taken as prizes from the French or their allies in the summer of 1417. The patrols in 1418 and 1419 did not have this level of success in acquiring prize vessels. Only the Holy Ghost of Spain was taken again by Hugh Courtenay in August 1419. But the presence of enemy vessels in the Channel had undoubtedly greatly decreased, and with that the sense of alarm in royal circles. It is also the case that by the end of 1417, the Genoese had lost a total of 8 carracks to the English. That is, the 3 taken and the 1 wrecked off Harfleur in 1416, and the 5 mentioned above. Losses on this scale of such expensive vessels, essential to the success of Genoese seaborne trade, could not continue, especially as these large vessels were privately owned by groups of wealthy Genoese, not the property of the state. All the patrolling squadrons in the Channel had a substantial corps of royal ships. They also included routinely 1 or more of either the great ships or the former Genoese carracks. Thus, in the summer of 1417, Huntingdon's forces were led by the Trinity Royal and the Holy Ghost, while a smaller force led by Lord Castellon included the Mary Sandwich, one of the renamed Genoese carracks. In 1418, John Arundel, the deputy of the Lord Admiral the Duke of Exeter, was in command of a force including the ex-Genoese carracks Peter, Christopher and Andrew. It was now well understood what type of vessel was likely to be most effective in the kind of boarding action usual at this date. Even the Gracieur's only known voyage was undertaken as part of the patrolling group of 1420. She had been built on the assumption that a ship of her design and dimensions would be able to overcome any possible adversary, but was never called upon to prove this in combat. This is a much later picture. In fact, it's a contemporary woodcut of an encounter between the Venetians and the Turks off the coast of the Peloponnese. But I've included it because you can see each fleet had one large high-sided vessel. You can see them there, and this has been a little bit cut off, but you can just about see the galleys circling these vessels, and you can understand the extreme difficulty of a conflict between high-sided vessels and much lower vessels or much lower freeboard. The apparent commanders of these patrols were usually a nobleman of high rank with experience of land warfare. The outstanding example of this is John Holland, known as the Earl of Huntingdon from early 1416 until he finally received the title of Duke of Exeter in 1444. He was the notional commander of the successful patrol fleet of 1417. The remainder of his distinguished military career, however, was spent in land campaigns. Behind these noble commanders, there was a corps of experienced seamen, most with close connections to the West Country and experience in maritime combat, gained in the somewhat contentious area of commerce raiding for the most part, which Chris has been talking about. Among this group, the Courtenay family and the Carews are conspicuous, and also such figures as our great friend John Hawley of Dartmouth, and John William, his colleague, master of the royal ship, the Jesus. In August 1417, 20 of the masters of the king's ships were granted annuities from £5 to 10 marks at the Exchequer. Previously, masters had been paid by the voyage at the usual rate of 6d a day. This change to an annuity seems to signify that a corps of experienced seamen who were committed to the service of the crown existed on a much more permanent basis. At least some of these payments were made regularly until the death of Henry V. It is also notable that the system of regular patrolling and its success were not forgotten by the maritime community and those who were put at risk by hostile shipping in the waters of England's coasts. A scheme for the guarding of the seas, put forward by the Commons in the Parliament of 1442, envisaged a scheme very like the patrols mounted by the Crown over 20 years earlier. The Commons requested that a squadron based around 8 great ships should be at sea continuously between Candlemas and Martinmas, with supporting balingers, barges and pinnaces, at a total cost of over £4,500. With this in place, the keeping of the sea would be assured, a view that links well with those of the writer of the libels some 6 years earlier, when he looked back to the great dromons of Henry V. Henry's own aims, as far as we can discern them, were both pragmatic and realistic. He was faced with a new situation in the Channel. The presence in support of his adversary France, of a force of ships which was capable of preventing the landing of an English expeditionary force on the French side of the Channel, or of impeding its later supply and reinforcement. To counter this, he needed great ships, able to take on Genoese carracks in a series of boarding actions, and swift, smaller ships as scouts. This was in addition, of course, to the long-standing need of English ships, of English kings, for transports and general logistical support. The need for these vessels seems to have become urgent sometime in early 1416. From that point on, the developments at Southampton, the building of ships, the appointments of new administrators, and eventually the employment of a system of regular sea patrols were pushed ahead rapidly and consistently. The libel envisages the king as having the ambition of being Lord of the Sea. In practice, this probably meant no more than being able to secure the safety of English shipping in the Channel and other trade routes of most concern to English merchants, especially that leading to Bordeaux. Henry's response to the particular situation arriving from the French-Genoese alliance was well-focused, practical and effective. When on his death the danger from hostile ships in the Channel seemed no longer to exist, it was not surprising that the government of Henry VI, concentrating on land warfare, abandoned any attempt to support and develop what was in effect the embryo of a royal navy. The high cost of royal ships was also probably a factor in the decision of the Crown, severely financially and under severe financial pressure, to cease to have any vessels of its own by the late 1430s. The loss of all English lands in France, except Calais and the Pale, by 1453, a resurgence of commerce raiding, and the shock of the French raid on Sandwich in 1457 were all clear indications of the flaws in this policy. Sir John Fortescue pointed this out in his tract, The Governance of England, written for the benefit of Edward IV. It was not, however, until the reign of Henry VII and the beginnings of the rise in the use of effective gunpowder artillery in combat at sea that the Crown once more began to take seriously the development of royal ships in the defence of the realm. If you can see this, which is not very clear.
2 minutes.
This is from 1485. You can just about see cannon over the gunwale there. This is one of the guns off the Mary Rose. It's on a replica gun carriage, but you see the culverin there. And there is the Mary Rose from the Antony roll in all her glory. So you can, by the time you get to the reign of Henry VIII, this is the image of the royal ships. And you can, one can perhaps state that Henry V's policy had anticipated the founding of a royal navy, but it was stopped in its tracks by Henry's early death and the change in the strategic conditions at sea. Thank you very much.